Throughout the years of the show, we focused in on school threats. Actually, we did this about a year ago after the horrible massacre at Oxford, Michigan, 1 year ago. But the question is, how do we deal with these threats at our nation's schools? Keep in mind that you're here to go to school, to learn, get an education, blah 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 blah. Blah 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 blah. I mean, go to school, learn, get your high school diploma, get your education, and get on with your life. But you keep doing things to interrupt that process. That's what I mean by the blah blah blah. So take a look at this from News4Jax.
Possibly armed with a weapon. Welcome back. Threats at school, a daily fear many parents and students face. This week, that fear hit many across Georgia when hoax threats were called in at high schools, and that included several in our area, Southeast Georgia. 12 Georgia school districts were hit with threats that turned out to be hoaxes. That's according to state law enforcement officers. The next day, here in Duval County, students at Lakeshore Middle School went into lockdown after a bus driver reported seeing a suspicious person, possibly armed with a weapon. We met parents outside the school who rushed to campus. Sadly, these kind of scenarios are too common, and they're happening more often, it feels like. So joining us now is Dr. Tracy Alloway. Dr. Alloway, first off, thank you so much for being here to talk to us about this important issue.
Thank you for having me.
And this is an issue that many families think about on a daily basis. I admit I'm one of them. I have a child in school. So what kind of conversations should parents have with their children about threats at school?
Such an important question, and it's really quite sad that we do have to consider this. But there's an acronym that we can keep in mind. It's the ILA. And the I stands for identify. So the first thing that the parent can address with the child is to encourage the child to identify where that stress is being held for them. If the child is starting to feel stress, they may start exhibiting signs of stomach aches, headaches, shoulder aches, and they may start disengaging and want not to go to school. So as a parent, it's important to ask the child, identify where are you holding some of the stress. The L stands for the label. It's important for the child to feel comfortable that they can express and label that emotion. Are they feeling scared? Are they feeling angry? Are they feeling frustrated? It's important for the child to feel that they have a word that they can use to help communicate how they're feeling. And the A is to act. In situations like this, we often feel out of control. There's so many factors that are not within our immediate level of control. And for the child, the parent can encourage them to at least identify one thing. What is one action that they can do to put that sense of control, that sense of agency back into their hands?
Very, very important. Let's also talk about the impact this has on parents. Talk about ways that parents can alleviate their own anxiety and fears as they drop their children off for school, or that they get on the bus and head to school. How can they alleviate some of their anxiety as parents?
Yeah, such a good question. Oftentimes, anxiety is rooted in something that's happening in the future. And one way to help manage some of that is to have a plan in place. So for the parent, they may want to know, maybe even the route the bus is taking, what happens once they get in school, what plans does the school have as a contingency, what can they offer to their child to do, who can they call, do they have access to a phone? So having these types of information in place can help minimize some of the stress and anxiety from the parent's perspective as well.
And also talk about resources that are available right now to local families. This is important.
It is important, and the key here is to keep in mind that it's important to discuss these things rather than to try to push this down. As a licensed psychologist, sometimes I have clients that try to minimize or kind of push it to the side. Oh, it's not a big deal, or it's not going to happen to me. Equally, you can have individuals that may catastrophize and may view this as an all or nothing situation. So it's important to find a balance, and sometimes talking to a licensed therapist, a licensed counselor can be helpful. Now more than ever, there's so many resources available, even online therapy available if the individual doesn't have access to an in-person session. So really the important thing here is to feel comfortable communicating that anxiety, that stress, and getting some skills and some tools from a licensed individual to help work through that.
And as always, it's important to know that even though these conversations are difficult, it is okay to have them and to reassure children that they can come to their parents and to talk about this if they do have fear.
Absolutely, such an important point to keep in mind, to keep that safe space, to keep that conversation open between the parent and the child.
All right, doctor, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And communication is really the key here. The key point here for parents is you need to talk to your kids. Communication is the key point here. You have to identify and label. You really need to talk to your children about this. If they're feeling stressed, then you gotta where are you stressed out? Like headaches, shoulder aches, this, etc. That's the whole point here. You need to really talk to your kids. You need to tell your kids that this is happening, they won't be punished. Together, you come up with a solution. That's how we can deal with this. And how do we put an end to this? We put an end to this by teaching the kids right and wrong. That's why if we started a Scared Straight program, we put the kids in jail during their suspension. Like if it was in school suspension, then what we would do, the child during their days of in school suspension during the school day, they'd be spending the school day in jail with a prison guard and inmates, and they'll tell us, okay, this is where you'll be going to if you do this and that. You'll be locked in jail. You'll be doing tasks in your inmate suit, stripped down, searched, etc. Just like you see movies. So the bottom line here is communicate with your kids so it doesn't happen again. Come out next. This adopted mother says she adopted two of the adopted sisters because the original parent's mother had issues, real issues. But when the adoptive kids came in with the mother, trouble began throughout the kid's life, throughout the kid years and the teenage years. Stay with us. Now an issue about adoption. For millions of parents, adoption is a dream come true. Chances are you may have adopted some of your kids as foster parents. What if you found out that your children, foster children, had never did what you told them? Like, they're hearing something else. You're about to meet a woman who adopted two sisters. And what happened next throughout the years would trouble even their older kids, not the adoptive kids, the sons and daughters. Here's Margaret Larson.
The story of the Lux family began as most do, with a wedding. Two academics with promising careers. Mike Lux was a professor of philosophy, a rising star at Notre Dame, and a professor of literature at nearby St. Mary's. Before long, there were children, a girl, then two boys. Ann and Mike bought a comfortable suburban home in South Bend, Indiana. They seemed to have it all. In fact, so much, it felt natural to share it. But nothing in their world prepared them for the kind of pain those good intentions could cause.
We both had wanted a larger family, and we somehow thought that 3 biological children was probably enough biological children.
And we never joined the Peace Corps or the Papal Volunteers, so we thought we could adopt children.
An agency handling welfare department adoptions offered 2 girls, sisters, Sandy, who was almost 4, and Julie, a year younger. The Luxes say they were told the girls' mother loved them, but couldn't keep them because of a drinking problem.
We had also been told that they were abused and neglected.
They say the social worker didn't volunteer details, and the Luxes didn't press for any. At the time, they didn't think it mattered, believing a loving home and a fresh start could conquer anything. They took their 3 kids to meet the girls at the zoo.
We thought they were marvelous. We just fell in love with them instantly. They were so cute. They were so tiny. They were so sweet. They were so vulnerable.
Over popcorn and treats at the petting farm, Mike and Ann decided to adopt them.
Sandy was real delicate. Julie was real kind of funny and smiley. And they just charmed us.
They were little and cute
Joe, the middle child, was 6 then. Lori, the oldest, was 7.
We had lots of romantic visions, at least my sisters and I did, of how the three of us would live together. I didn't have any sisters when my sisters came.
Just 3 weeks after they met, Sandy and Julie came to live with the Luxes for good.
Each one of them had a brown paper bag, grocery bag of clothes, and one stuffed animal.
And a scrapbook from their foster mother. A few photographs, old valentines, and a lock of Sandy's hair were all that had been saved of the girls' past.
They loved the house. They went all over the house, and they went in all the bedrooms and all the closets. They were happy here. They seemed to be happy here.
It all started with such high hopes, the Luxes had no idea what was coming. The adoption agency had held back an extensive file on the girls, information about the traumas they had suffered in their young lives. Without those details, Ann and Mike were almost totally unequipped to handle what would happen next.
When did you first notice with each of the girls that there might be problems here that you had not anticipated?
The first day.
The first day?
The first day.
From the very start, there were signs of trouble. At the backyard picnic table, when dinner was over, everyone got up to play, except Julie.
She cried, she whimpered, she just didn't want to move on. She wanted to keep on eating.
No matter how they tried to convince her she was full, Julie just wanted more, eating as though she could never get enough. In the meantime, 4-year-old Sandy was busy dumping buckets of sand all over the lawn.
And so I would go up to her and say, okay, now let's keep the sand in the sandbox. And she couldn't hear me. She couldn't understand what I was saying.
What do you mean, she was just glazed over?
She just looked off into the distance. And we just weren't communicating at all. It was an eerie feeling.
Did it scare you?
It did, enormously.
That night, things got worse. As Sandy slept on the top bunk in the girls' room, she rocked violently.
And she actually rocked so much that the bed and the trundle bed shook.
You could hear it. You could hear it in the living room, the thrashing. Sandy would thrash in the bed, cast herself from one side of the bed to the other, really shake the floor upstairs.
I remember thinking, boy, this is really weird.
For months afterwards, Lori had to sleep on a cot inside the closet to escape the racket.
And you just think, this is not right. There's something behind this kind of behavior. What dreams was she having? What was she working out? It was as if she were trying to escape something.
In those first days, Ann and Mike were worried enough to consult the social worker, who seemed to think the girls just needed to settle in. But time didn't help. Julie, the little girl who wouldn't leave the picnic table, sneaked into cupboards and ate whatever she could find, whole bags of cookies, 30 pieces of gum.
She couldn't spend time in the kitchen alone because she would simply go and eat.
And she would eat continuously?
If allowed, yes.
Ann and Mike were so taken up with Julie's food problems, they almost didn't notice what Sandy was doing. She'd begun taking things from around the house, hiding them in her room, always detached and never wanting to be touched.
The image of her is someone sort of creeping around the house, crawling around underneath the table and things like this.
Less than a month after they'd taken the girls in, Ann and Mike felt their family life spinning out of control. So they arranged for a meeting at the welfare office, now ready to search out more about the girls' past. Reluctantly, a caseworker revealed part of their file.
And she would read out sentences to us and ask us if this is what we wanted to know. And after every sentence, she would say, is this enough?
They say what they were told was overwhelming. The girls' parents were both alcoholics. The children had shuttled in and out of foster care, never living anywhere for more than 6 months. Julie had been hospitalized at 3 months for malnutrition. Sandy had been taken away repeatedly after social workers found bruises all over her face. The details were so painful, Ann and Mike said no more. They'd heard enough.
Did you have a sense at that point that you might be in over your head?
Yeah.
Did you think about saying, I can't do this?
No.
They felt they'd made a commitment and couldn't go back, so they tried to ignore their apprehension, certain they could shape the girls to fit into the family. After all, they were only 3 and 4 years old.
The assumption sort of is you're going to make them fit the mold you've already got going there. And I think it's very hard to overcome that attitude.
But over the next few years, Anne and Mike's confidence was replaced with frustration and anger. Instead of settling in, the girls' behavior became more disruptive. Both girls continually lied, took things from the other kids, and refused to apologize. And they seemed unwilling or unable to follow even simple directions.
They did things over and over and over and never could seem to predict that the result would be the same.
Anne and Mike's relief to get them into elementary school was short-lived. Before long, their teachers were complaining. The girls couldn't sit still, couldn't concentrate, couldn't seem to learn. Anne and Mike hired tutors and took them to doctors and therapists, but nothing seemed to help. Not knowing what else to do, they poured on the discipline, more rules, more structure. All that did was make everyone angrier.
Anne and I would lay awake at night and talk about how it just wasn't working and how we couldn't deal with the problems. And then we'd try to convince ourselves it would all get better.
Through it all, they worried they were neglecting their biological children. Tension in the house was a constant.
I can see my mom in the back door with a look of real stress on her face, but I can't remember why.
Despite consultation with experts, Julie's eating problems persisted. At school, a teacher found her rooting through the garbage looking for scraps of food. At home, sweets had to be hidden in the car trunk to keep them away from her.
Food couldn't be a kind of source of joy and a center of family life. Going into a restaurant and having a meal, that was a problem.
Even 7 years after her adoption, when Julie was in the 4th grade, the school nurse caught her stuffing herself with other kids' leftovers. Anne and Mike were worn down, irritable, knowing now that their impatience had become part of the problem.
Did you think you were a bad parent?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I surely did. That we just weren't successful in dealing with these problems.
Anne's stress was compounded by a gut-wrenching guilt. Deep down, she knew her adopted daughters needed acceptance and love. But to her horror, what she felt was resentment.
I would go in to kiss them at night, and I would think, I don't want to kiss them as much as I want to kiss this other child. And I was always coming up short, judging myself not doing this right.
And the adopted daughters in your family could feel that.
Oh, there is no question. They were so sensitive. And I knew they could feel it. That makes the guilt so much worse. I knew they knew.
Mike, too, was feeling guilty and inadequate as an adoptive parent, and because of that, he cringed at the praise of friends and colleagues.
The kind of constant reaction of people was, what a wonderful thing you're doing, what saints you are, what great moral heroes you are. And we knew that we were botching it, we weren't doing things well.
In some ways, blaming themselves was easier than considering the alternative.
There is the thought, there's constantly the thought that perhaps there's nothing you can do.
Had the girls been forever damaged by early childhood traumas? In those first years, the Luxes had come a long way from their initial assumptions that love would come easily, that a fresh start could fix everything.
We really believed that love would conquer all. We believed that environment was the whole story with children.
What do you think now?
I don't think that.
But whatever they'd experienced so far, it was nothing compared to what was just around the corner, the girls' teenage years.
Wow. When we come back, the teen years for Sandy and Julie. Would they listen to their mother? Would things get worse? Margaret Larson continues to look into the adoptive sisters. Stay with us. The teenage years can be a struggle, but for the Luxes, those teen years meant trouble for the adoptive sisters. Trouble that threatened to shut down their family. The question is, could they stay together or could things get worse? As Margaret Larson continues, you will hear what happened throughout those teen years.
10 years after their adoptions, as they hit adolescence, Sandy and her younger sister Julie seemed to completely switch roles in the family. Julie's compulsive eating had put her center stage throughout their elementary school years. Sandy had been the quiet one, so withdrawn her parents called her their disappearing child. But all that changed when Sandy became a teenager and went wild.
Those years were a nightmare. It was a battleground here.
Ann and Mike used all the typical punishments: grounding, docked allowances, extra chores. It worked for their biological kids, but didn't seem to faze their adopted daughters. Looking back, they suspect their heavy discipline had only made things worse.
I was too insistent on my way. I needed to give way a lot more.
School was a particular hot button. Ann and Mike insisting on good grades, Sandy and Julie always falling short.
We set standards that were probably impossible for those little girls to meet.
Instead of melding into the family, the girls drifted farther away. Julie now turned into the loner, Sandy the rebel, defying her parents and teachers at every turn, and shoplifting clothes and jewelry from neighborhood stores.
She said, I can be the best at being the worst.
By 10th grade, she was failing classes left and right, and she discovered alcohol, drinking, it seemed, without limits.
We did not know what to do with Sandy. I mean, she was acting out in such self-destructive ways.
Julie briefly grabbed the spotlight again when at 16 she tried to kill herself by swallowing a handful of aspirin. And after years of eating whatever she could find, Julie suddenly became bulimic, throwing up meal after meal. Ann took her to a doctor who scared Julie into stopping. But at that point, Ann and Mike felt they were just careening from crisis to crisis and paying less attention than ever to their biological children.
We did get away with more, probably, than we would have. I do think that that's the case.
Now, why is that? Their transgressions were up here and yours were down here, so...
Right, there's that. And also, my parents were tired. They're tired.
So tired, something had to give. Halfway through Sandy's 10th grade year, they sent her to boarding school, hoping for a fresh start.
It was like Sandy had a chance to begin again. That's what I thought. What Sandy thought was abandoned.
What they didn't know was that Sandy's rage was building. After summer break, Ann discovered a stash of stolen merchandise in the ceiling over Sandy's bed, and angry messages she'd scrawled on her mattress. It all seemed so ominous, like they'd come around a dangerous turn in the road.
I really was worried with how much hate she had inside of her because she wrote on the mattress. I couldn't imagine why she would write on the mattress. That was hard for me to understand.
Before long, Ann and Mike were fielding calls from the boarding school. Sandy was disruptive, maybe on drugs, sneaking out at night. Christmas of her junior year, the school kicked her out. Ann and Mike couldn't imagine bringing her home and couldn't find another private school that would accept her. Truthfully, were there times along the way that she wanted to say, that's it?
Yes, we really did, and we thought seriously about terminating the arrangement.
Instead, they found a nearby home for troubled teenagers and hoped again for a new beginning. But like clockwork, the reports flooded in. Sandy was cutting classes, spitting food on people, and having sex in the parking lot. Most of all, she was furious with her parents. Mike installed deadbolts around the house, concerned Sandy would get out and come home to harm the family. A few months later, they got the call. Sandy had run away, and no one could find her. 2 weeks later, Sandy found an unlocked door at home and sneaked in. She stole things, clothes, jewelry, even kidnapped the family dog. She and the dog turned up a week later, but the episode landed her in the juvenile detention center. There, she underwent a mental health evaluation, and for the next year, bounced from one expensive mental hospital to another, each move sending her into hysterics.
She would just run wild the first few days, tear off her clothes. She was just in despair.
Eventually, there was a diagnosis: borderline personality disorder, most likely brought on by early childhood abuse. At 17, Sandy escaped and hit the road with a group of truckers. She was raped, then picked up by police and returned to the mental hospital. But just after she turned 18, the hospital's treatment limit of a year expired, and they released her. Ann and Mike desperately searched for more help, but the best place they could find was a halfway house. From there, though, it was a short trip to the streets. Sandy got hooked on crack and soon found a frightening way to support her habit.
It was a gradual move downward. We could see it coming.
To Ann and Mike's horror, Sandy, the quiet little girl who didn't like to be touched, became a prostitute.
We could see that there wasn't any other way she was going to be able to be in life. Does that make sense? She couldn't keep a job. She wanted to have something different every single day. She had to have an adventure. She loved risk, a thrill seeker.
Before long, she was arrested. Her name was in the paper.
I really felt for my father.
The view is...
By this time, Mike was a top administrator at Notre Dame, and his daughter's arrest was big news.
It was embarrassing, yeah, surely. The people were quite good. Nobody said much.
The problem is you're losing your daughter. It doesn't really matter who knows.
By then, the biological children were off to college, then graduate school and careers. But Sandy was on a different path, a regular at the county jail, arrested 30 times in 5 years for disorderly conduct, public intoxication, and prostitution. To her family, she seemed one small step away from death.
I had a dream that I would be asked to identify her body. And I felt it, and it was like clay. And I think that's the kind of fear that a parent of a child like this has.
Julie, too, was all but lost to the family. Just before she turned 18, she left high school, moved away, and got married. After 15 years of heartache and turmoil, the adopted daughters were finally gone, and Ann thought she might get her life back. But in her now quiet house, and to her enormous surprise, she found no relief. Instead, she missed them and began thinking about the girls without focusing on the battles.
They had great senses of humor, and they were daring and brave.
Suddenly, she realized how much she loved them. Not the automatic kind of love she felt for her biological kids, but something else, just as real.
And I think, looking back, that love comes very slowly, that they made us love them. But it was a gradual process.
A process that made her see the girls had needed much less discipline and far more love and acceptance. Looking back on that was beyond painful.
I was a failure as a mother, the thing that meant most to me. I couldn't love right, and I couldn't forgive myself.
So she started to write about her family, to search for answers, to confess, to apologize. The writings turned into a newly published book called The Limits of Hope, dedicated to her adopted daughters. To Julie, who craved what Ann couldn't give.
I think that Julie's hunger for food from the very beginning was hunger for love.
To Sandy, who had suffered so much.
We wanted me to be able to do all the things they promised, to erase it all, to take away all the pain, to love without boundaries. We wanted that, both of us. And I couldn't do it.
Could her daughters ever understand, or more importantly, forgive? One of them had by now started a new life in another state. The other was dodging the law, and neither of them wanted anything to do with their mother. So Ann set out to try to make things right. to correct what had taken root in such good intentions, but had gone so wrong.
When we return, would Sandy and Julie ever accept their mother's apology? When we return, you're going to hear both sides of the story from the adoptive sisters. And we're also going to learn from the earlier abuse that these two have suffered. Margaret Larson at the conclusion of our story. Stay with us. Sandy and Julie Lux, two great adoptive sisters. One landed in jail, the other married. But is there more to the story than meets the eye? We're about to hear both sides of the story as they tell what was it like growing up with the Lux family. Be ready to hear both sides of the story as Margaret Larson concludes the ties that bind.
Two sisters, born just a year apart and raised together, today live very different lives.
Are you having fun?
Julie is 26, a wife and mother of two young boys, leading a quiet life in a suburban neighborhood. But Sandy, who disappears so often her parents occasionally report her missing, is at 27 a prostitute and drug addict. Why did one sister's life go so disastrously off track? Their parents believe one answer was buried in the girl's medical files, something they didn't find out for years.
I think that the deck was stacked against Sandy very early on, and at a point where her experiences were really pretty much beyond her control.
Sandy says one of her psychiatrists told her that she had been physically traumatized as a young child, treated for a fractured skull and broken ribs before her adoption, and he suspected she'd been sexually abused as well. Whatever abuse Julie had suffered appeared less severe, and unlike her sister, she had no memory of anything before her life with the Luxes. What's your first memory of being with them?
It'd be about, I don't know how old I'd be. I was making mud pies in the sandbox.
She also recalls doing troubling things she still can't figure out, like stockpiling food in her bedroom.
Sandy and I had talked about this, taking food up there and storing it.
Why do you think you might have done something like that?
Probably just afraid we weren't going to get to eat again.
What do you remember about school?
I loved school. I was terrible at school, but I did like school.
Were you concerned about your grades?
Yes, I really wanted to make good grades, and it just didn't seem like I could.
Julie remembers feeling intense pressure from her parents about school performance and being in trouble much of the time. What she doesn't remember is the kind of affection that seemed to flow so naturally to the biological kids. And that's a memory that still hurts.
I was really depressed growing up as a teenager. I didn't understand why I wasn't good enough for the Lux family.
Sandy didn't understand either. When we found her, she was still on the streets and still angry about her upbringing. She agreed to talk to us only about her childhood. What do you remember about coming to live with the Luxes? Do you remember the day you got there?
Yeah, I remember. I knew it was permanent, and I didn't. I wasn't happy with it.
The little girl who dumped sand all over the yard and seemed not to hear anyone knew her biological mother was gone for good.
You know, I guess as a kid you just feel for your mother, whatever. You know what I'm saying? And I knew that it was permanent. You know, I wasn't, she wasn't coming.
When you met the other kids, what'd you think about them?
Intimidated.
By what?
That this wasn't where I belonged.
She was the child who didn't want anyone to touch her, the one who violently rocked herself to sleep.
It soothed me. I guess that was my way of giving myself affection that I felt I should have gotten.
As a teenager, she says she was constantly under attack.
Criticism, nonstop criticism.
Made you feel bad about yourself.
Yeah, I didn't live up to their standards.
In school?
I deliberately messed up in school. Because that was the one thing that I knew they really cared for,
What do you wish you'd had growing up that you didn't have?
A mother.
A mother who, after years of guilt, anger, and pain, has written it all out in a book that is both an apology to her girls and a plea to other adoptive parents.
Accept your children. They are not going to do what you want, and you might even be right, but they're not going to do it. Accept.
She talks a lot about feeling very guilty, feeling like she didn't come through as a mom for you and Sandy. Do you think she did?
She supplied a lot of things for us that we didn't have and we probably wouldn't have had. But then again, I think the most thing that we needed the most was love, and we didn't really have that.
Love you.
So Julie's made sure it's something her own boys never lack.
I tell my kids every night I love them, and I make sure that they know without a doubt that I love them, and I'd do anything for them.
Anne's book about their lives set off a flood of angry letters from Julie, filled with accusations, but eventually with understanding.
The dialogue has never stopped. It goes on. It's what saved us.
For Julie, the dialogue was enough to bring her home. Last year, she and her family moved back to South Bend to be closer to Anne and Mike. But it was the next generation, Julie's children, who closed the gap between them.
Julie told me that she has a chance to watch the mother I would have been for her through the grandmother I am with her children.
She's excellent. I can't think of anything that I would want her to change. Not a thing.
With one adopted daughter, finally, a bond as tight as blood. Do you feel like they love you?
Yes.
And do you love them?
Yes. Very much. I feel like they're my parents.
But with another daughter, separation and continued heartache.
I feel like really this book is her way of trying to fix up and perfect, like she does everything else, make herself feel better.
She said she wrote the book in part as an apology to you and Julie. Did you take it that way?
No.
You don't believe that?
It was written for her to, succeed in the one thing she failed at,
There are faint glimmers of hope for Sandy's life. For 8 months last year, she cleaned up, got a job, and came home for the holidays. But then, it all fell apart. She was back on the streets with her mom and dad worrying once again.
I'm afraid of losing her. I'm afraid she'll die or be killed.
Since our interview with Sandy, she was arrested for a parole violation. She's now locked up in the county jail, awaiting a trial that could send her to prison for up to 4 years. So why did an adoption that started out with such high hopes cause so much pain? Did the girls' behavior make them unlovable? Were their parents too idealistic or naive about adding to their biological family?
If I adopted 2 kids, I don't know how I could love them as much as my kids. I think you'd have to. It takes time.
I think they thought it would be easy. I think they thought that all kids were like theirs. Sorry we weren't, like you planned.
23 years ago, Anne and Mike believed childhood trauma was erasable. Now they wonder if the girls' abuse set behavior in motion that the most devoted parenting couldn't change.
I think there are ways in which we could have been better parents, but I don't know that the results would have been dramatically different.
For Anne, there is acceptance now of the limits of hope, and an answer, finally, to a question she once dreaded, a question the young Julie asked repeatedly years ago.
Are you glad you adopted us, Mom? Are you glad you adopted us, Mom? Are you glad you adopted us, Mom? Are you glad you... She would not let me go because she knew I couldn't answer that question the way she wanted me to. But I can answer it now. And yes, I'm glad, Julie.
The agency that handled the Lux adoption told Dateline it couldn't comment because of confidentiality concerns. And the Welfare Department says the case happened too long ago to track down the facts. But both agencies say it's their policy to give adoptive parents full information, as long as it doesn't reveal the birth parent's identity. If you're thinking of adopting an older child, here is some advice from adoption experts. Keep asking questions. Even if they produce painful answers, the more you know early, the better prepared you'll be for any problems that might arise later. And ask for a written report of the child's history and review it with your doctor.
The bottom line is, be prepared when it comes to adopting your first child, because you're going to have a long time to think about this. So if you're well prepared to adopt a child, be prepared to what you're headed for, because you don't want to go down the same path like the Luxes did. Stay with us for a preview of Give Me a Break Monday. Coming up on Give Me a Break Monday, there was a plot to kill a local sheriff who was famous enough for his chain gang and feeding them off bologna sandwiches. You're about to meet some interesting characters in this story. One person who went to jail, the other person who spoke to him about who told him he joined the mob, and the attorney who said that he wanted out of this case. The plot thickens. That's on Monday. That's Give Me a Break for this Saturday. We'll see you again with Give Me a Break Monday. For all of us here at YouTube and Give Me a Break, I hope you've had a great day. It's your body, your choice. Have a good night.